Icons are one of the most commonly used UI elements. So as product designers, we need to have a really good handle on how to use them effectively in our designs, how to organize them, and then also how to prepare them successfully for handoff. This lesson is going to be a crash course on everything icons, where I cover all of the best practices that I think you need to succeed as a designer. Let's dive in. When you're building out a design system, part of that process is always going to involve creating some sort of an icon library that sits at the top level of your design system. We talked about this in the previous lesson, but the icon library is one of the three primary files that you're going to be importing everywhere. Because think about all of the times that you use things like arrows and chevrons in your designs. You want to make sure that this is accessible at every place in your Figma organization. Now, the first best practice is within the icon library itself, it's important to have each icon be a consistent size. And so my default is I like to make sure that each one of these is 16 pixels. And the reason is because it makes your developers' lives just a little bit easier. If they can export every icon at a consistent size, then they can have standardized resizing logic where they can use it for every single icon. So that's just another little thing that you can do to enhance the collaboration that you have with the engineers on your team. Next, you're going to want to make sure that your constraints for the icons themselves are set to scale. And this is pretty crucial because if every icon's at 16 pixels, ultimately when we use them in our designs, we're probably going to have multiple different sizes, and we want to make sure that our icons are going to expand as our bounding box expands. Another pro tip is it's good practice to define a handful of sizes that icons can be. Probably something in the range of 2 to 4. I typically just go with small, medium, large, and I'll make it 16 pixels, 20 pixels, and 24 pixels. And that fits into pretty much every use case that I'm going to have when I use icons. And the nice thing then is, going back to our previous point here about keeping this resizing logic the same for developers, if there are a consistent 3 sizes, then they're going to be able to create variables for those sizes. And whenever they use one of our SVGs in code, they can really quickly say size equals small or size equals medium. And that's going to make things a lot more efficient to build and standardize the different icon sizes that we're using throughout our UI. Another thing that is crucial when we're talking about resizing icons is thinking strategically about how we're handling our stroke widths. Personally, I really like to use icon libraries that have stroke widths available, and that just gives me a little bit more flexibility around the thickness of my icons. But once I have an icon finalized, I want to make sure that I will flatten it. And the way that you do that, if you're not familiar, is by selecting the icon, and then you can hit Command-Shift-O to turn it from a stroke into a fill. You can see if I flip back and forth, that's the change. And what that does is, as I resize an icon that has been flattened, the old stroke is going to scale proportionately with the size of the icon, versus this bottom scenario where I left all 3 as outlines and the stroke doesn't scale. It stays that consistent 6 pixels across the 3 icon sizes. And that presents a few challenges, because if a developer exports your icon at this small size, and you scale it up in Figma without flattening it, it will look like this here. But in code, it's going to look like this. And so you'll create this discrepancy at the larger sizes if you don't flatten your icons before handing them off to developers. Another reason we should be flattening our icons too is that it makes the file size significantly smaller. Now, on the topic of flattening your icons, it's important to note that once you flatten your icon, you lose the ability to change the stroke width. So what I typically will do in my icon libraries is I'll have a section for staging icons and production icons. And the staging icons will keep the stroke width so that I can play with them and have a little bit more flexibility. Because if 6 months from now I realize that I want to make my icons a little bit thinner, I would not have the ability to do that. But if I have my staging icon set, I can really easily decrease the stroke width and then just move them into my production icons. And the nice thing is, if I just copy the contents of this icon and put it into the existing main component, it's automatically going to populate throughout all of my designs, and I'm not going to have to change any of the nested components. One of my favorite use cases for variants is being able to group similar icons like chevrons, arrows, more menus, eyes, radios, things like that. So if we open up our menu here, we can see how much easier it is to define these properties instead of having to say arrow down, arrow left, arrow right. And also, whenever I'm searching for components in my little menu here, I don't have to have arrow right, I can just have arrow. And it's the little things like that that make life in Figma just a little bit easier. One of my favorite icon hacks in Figma is something that I call an icon wrapper. And it solves a problem that I'm pretty sure you've probably experienced at some point. Now, if we look at this base button component, it's powering this grid of a single button. And you can see that we have variants across different types, as well as sizes, and then half of them are web and half of them are mobile. So we have some pretty significant size discrepancies here. And so what happens traditionally if we would just drop our arrow icon in here, which is what I've done here, I have arrow test. If I resize this instance to be small mobile, I no longer have the ability to resize this icon, which is pretty unfortunate because this icon is definitely overpowering this piece of text. I typically don't want the icon to appear so much larger vertically than the text itself. So how do we solve that? Well, we have to back up a step here. Instead of dropping my arrow directly into my button, I'm first going to use an icon wrapper component. And if we look at this here, all it is 3 variants, small, medium, and large, going back to those predetermined sizes that we talked about earlier. And then inside of that, I have included my icon component from before. So now if I take this and swap out my icon for an icon wrapper, now when I come over here, I have given myself a variance dropdown of my different sizes. So I can really quickly bump this down to small, and voila, everything looks optically balanced and it's super easy. So what I've started doing is including an icon wrapper in my top level icon library. And that way, when I know that I'm going to nest an icon within another component, I'll always insert my icon wrapper. I can easily swap out any icon that I would like, but it gives me those predetermined 3 variants that will allow me to switch the size. And that's going to be really, really valuable, especially when we're dealing with responsive design and switching between web and mobile, where we might have some pretty significant size discrepancies between the two. A quick note on organizing your icons. Not every icon should live in your top level icon library. And this is an example of icons that actually should only be specific to the product level component that they're powering. I have a sidebar here that's in my dashboard components, and then I have custom icons that relate specifically to this sidebar. It's the only place they're used in my product. As a result, I'll put these in my product level component library because I don't want them to be imported anywhere other than this one specific use case. Whereas something like a chevron, I'll put in my icon library because I'm probably going to use it everywhere. Another good thing to remember is to pay attention to your layer names. In order to preserve overrides when we're swapping out different icons, Figma requires us to use the same naming. So what I'll typically do as a best practice is to name pretty much everything icon. Whatever the child level layer is in my icon here, I'll name it icon. And then whenever I embed an icon into a button or something like that, I'll make sure to name that icon. And that way, as I'm swapping out different icons or changing variants, I know that any of my color overrides are going to persist. Okay, one final note is don't feel like you have to be able to design your own icons in order to succeed as a product designer. I am borderline terrible at designing my own icons. It's hard. Instead, there are a ton of really high quality free libraries that you can rely on. Right now, my favorite by far is Phosphor Icons. They have a bunch of different pre-built weights. And so not only do I have the flexibility to be able to customize it because they are stroke icons and not fill icons, but I can click a button and make sure that I have a cohesive light icon. Simple as that. And so this is definitely one that I recommend trying out if you haven't already. The library is extensive, it's well designed, and it's pretty quickly become my go-to. I think you'll like it.